Now that we have our development tools in place, let's start implementing this part of the screen, the message section. So what we want to do is, whenever the user clicks in one of these elements here, so the thread summary in the thread section, whenever we click inside one of these elements, we want to dispatch a new action to the store that it's going to be called something like thread selected. So we are going to dispatch in the payload of the action, we're going to dispatch the ID of the thread that got selected. That is going to go directly to the store, and the store is going to produce a new state where the current thread ID is going to be updated. This part of the application is going to be notified that this new state is available, and it's going to render the messages of the current thread accordingly. We are also going to add some styling so that we can clearly identify what thread is currently selected. We are going to paint the background of the currently selected thread in blue. So let's get started implementing this functionality. Let's go back to our program to the thread section component. Let's have a look at the template of the thread section component. As we can see, each thread is inside the thread list. So what we really want to do is, because this is a purely presentational component, we want to be notified here of a thread selected custom event, a component event. We want to subscribe to this event, and in response to this event, we want to call a method here on the thread section component. We are going to call it onThreadSelected, and we want to pass it in the payload of the thread selected event that was emitted. In this case, this will contain the ID of the thread that was selected. So let's implement this method here in the thread section component. We are going to simply say that it takes only one parameter, which is the thread ID, which is a number. Actually, we are going to call it the selected thread ID. Now, whenever we receive a selected thread ID, what we are going to do is we are going to dispatch to the store a new action. Let's implement this afterwards. Right now, let's implement the mechanism that emits a custom event in thread list. So let's take the variable thread selected, and what we're going to do here is we are going to define a member variable called thread selector, which is of type event emitter. And actually we can simply assign it with a new event emitter, and then we need to annotate this member variable with the @output Angular annotation. So with Alt Command L, we're going to format everything. So now we have here a event emitter in the thread list component. So let's have a look now at the thread list component template. We have here the HTML template of the component. What we want to do here is we want to detect that a given thread was clicked. So let's say, for example, we want to detect that this particular thread was clicked. Each thread is a list item, so we are going to add here a click handler at the level of the list item. We're going to detect the browser click event, and on response to this event, we are going to call a thread list component method. We're going to call it select thread, and we're going to pass it in the ID of the thread selected. Now let's implement this method here in our thread list component. We are going to call the method select thread. It takes a thread ID of type number, and here we are simply going to emit a new value for the thread selected custom event. So we are going to call next here, and we're going to pass in the thread ID. So this completes the implementation of our click handler. Now let's go back to the thread section component. What we're saying here is whenever the thread selected event is triggered, we are going to trigger this method. So here we are going to dispatch a new action to the store. We're going to call the store, and we are going to call dispatch. We are going to create a new action. We are going to call to this action thread selected action, and we are going to pass in as the payload of the action the selected thread ID. Let's now define this action here in our actions file. So again, this will be a very simple class that will implement the action interface of NGRX store. Let's define the constructor. The constructor will have a payload which is a number. So the number that we pass in, we have seen it here, it's the selected thread ID. So let's import here the thread selected action, and let's give it also a type, otherwise our program will not compile. We are going to create a new type for this action. Let's call it simply thread selected action. So now we are dispatching an action and we will need to add a reducer to handle this new action. We are starting to have several actions and several reducers in our application. So let's now give a little bit more structure to our reducer functions.